God's sake.
It's for the best.
Eddie, please!
Almost done.
Hey everybody, what's going on? Back with a new video. Today I'm going to be discussing my top Stephen King books to read if you are new to Stephen King, if you really haven't read Stephen King, or if you have no idea where to start reading his work. I will help you with that. These are my recommendations. Now I'm really not going to go into details about these books because I have made a Stephen King tier list. If you want to go check that out, I'll leave the link in the description below. On my Stephen King tier list, I go into much greater detail with each book I discuss because, as you know, if you're a great friend of mine, a close friend, a subscriber, you know that I have read all of Stephen King's books from Carrie all the way to his newest book, Fairy Tale, and I'm very excited for when Holly comes out in September. I can't wait to read that. But as many of you know, I have read Stephen King in chronological order, and these books, to my knowledge, are in chronological order when I'm going to discuss them. There's not many of them, but I feel like these are great books to start if you are new to Stephen King or you have no idea where to start. Personally, I do recommend going in chronological order because Stephen King, his multiverse is connected in so many different ways, and his books interact with each other, whether it's characters, places such as Castle Rock or Derry, Maine. Again, a lot of that relates to many of his books. So let's jump into the first book, and the first book I recommend for those new readers, his very first published book, and that is Carrie. Now, a little known fact if you didn't know about Carrie, Stephen King actually threw his manuscript for Carrie in the trash can, but his wife Tabitha fished it out and encouraged Stephen King to publish it. Was that a lifesaver or what? Because the book Carrie became a great success story for Stephen King and a great way to start his career. A plus side to Carrie is not a very long book. It's about under 300 pages, like 270, 280, if I can remember correctly. So it's a very quick read, and his book would be a great starting point if you are new to Stephen King. My second book on the list is actually my personal favorite, my all-time favorite, still holds to this day, and that is Salem's Lot. Salem's Lot is the epitome of a vampire book. If you are a vampire lover like I am, that is a great book to read. Coincidentally enough, it is the second book published right after Carrie. Salem's Lot has a great cast of characters, and I do highly recommend it because the story really flows well. The occurrences that happen with the characters in the story is hands down why it's my favorite. It flows so well together. Salem's Lot is just over 400 pages. It's not a short read, but it's not a thick book either like a lot of his other stories, so I find this is a great way to start off, especially if you love vampires. The next book on my list is actually a Richard Bachman book, which is actually Stephen King's pseudonym, and it is The Long Walk. Stephen King wrote many other books under the name Richard Bachman, but The Long Walk is my absolute favorite under that name. The cast of characters is great. There's quite a few of them in this book, but these characters battle through hardships, adversity, and a lot of friendships are made throughout this journey. In my opinion, The Long Walk starts off great, and it just keeps going after that. Page after page, I kept turning. I wanted more of it, and the intensity kept rising as I kept going. So I highly recommend, especially if you have not read any of the Richard Bachman books, please go out and try The Long Walk. You won't be disappointed. Next on my list is actually a Castle Rock book, and the first of the Castle Rock books I recommend reading is the book Cujo. Now, if you've seen the movie Cujo, the book does more justice than the movie. I highly recommend, if you have not read the book Cujo, please go out and read it. It is a great book, filled with suspense, great characters. Again, Stephen King is a very good storyteller. He creates the most interesting and unbelievable characters in his stories, and that's what I love about Stephen King. There are many other books that Stephen King has written in the Castle Rock setting, but this is the first one in the chronological order if you are going to read in that pattern. Next is actually a book from a big series. It's a very popular series from Stephen King. Though this is not the best book in the series, I recommend you read it, especially if you want to get into this series, and that is Book 1 in the Dark Tower series, The Gunslinger. Like I mentioned, The Gunslinger isn't the most famous book out of the series. It isn't my favorite, but I will say that this is obviously one you need to start with when you read a series. I read this book in one day, and I actually read it in 3 or 4 hours. It's only 250 pages. It's a very quick read, and remember, you need to read this book if you are going to start the Dark Tower series. Personally, my favorite book in the Dark Tower series is book number 3, The Wastelands. Please start with The Gunslinger, and then the journey goes on from there. Next on my list is actually one I'm very passionate about. It is a book of 4 novellas. It is my favorite collection of stories by Stephen King, and that is Different Seasons. I find that Different Seasons would be a great starting point for you new Stephen King readers because each one of Stephen King's novellas in Different Seasons isn't that long, great characters, it goes nice and smooth, there's no rough patches in it, for my opinion anyways, and the entire book isn't that long. In Different Seasons, there is Rita Hayworth's in Shawshank Redemption, At Pupil, The Body, and The Breathing Method. My favorite out of Different Different Seasons would have to be The Body, but all the other ones are great as well. I highly recommend Different Seasons because I believe out of all of his other collections of novellas and short stories, it's more fitting for new readers who are new to Stephen King. Next time, a list actually made my top 10 Stephen King books, and I will leave a link in the description below if you want to check that video out as well, and that is Misery. Again, Misery is another book that is not that long. It's easy to read through, and the suspense and the horror aspect of it, psychological horror to be more specific, is amazing. And the way Stephen King wrote this book, and with the characters of Annie Wilkes and Paul Sheldon, great characters that battle wits with each other, and it's just, you want to keep reading it throughout. There's lots of mystery in it. There's lots of stuff you want to know about the characters as you read through, and once you find out in the ending, it's just a masterpiece of what Stephen King has written. Highly recommend Misery. Great read, and especially if you love psychological horror, this is a great book to start off with Stephen King. Okay, my last book on this list for my Stephen King books that I recommend for those new readers or for those who don't know where to start reading his book is an actual nonfiction book that Stephen King wrote as a writer and as a published author. I really loved reading this because I was actually reading this novel while I was writing my novel, and it is Stephen King's memoir of On Writing. Now, even if you don't plan on writing a book or writing stories or any of that matter, this still is a great story because it talks about Stephen King's childhood, how he became one of the most famous authors in today's world. He gave a lot of tips and strategies of how he wrote his books, and a lot of the information that is in this book obviously is factual, but it's really inspirational too. And like I mentioned, even if you never plan on writing a book, you read this and you're like, wow, that was amazing what he did and like what he overcame, because his childhood wasn't the best of childhood. And as he was growing up, he actually started as a teacher before he became an author, and when he was writing, he was teaching. Stephen King had a very tough road before he became one of the most famous authors. Again, this book is not that long. It's just over 300 pages, and I listened to the Audible version of this because I listen to Audible with all my reads, and Stephen King is actually the narrator of this himself. So if you love Audible and listen to Audible, I highly recommend you check out On Writing by Stephen King. Promise you won't be disappointed. All right, everyone, that is it. Thanks for stopping by. Remember, if you ever read Stephen King's book, or if you have any of his favorites, please comment in the comments below. I'm glad, I love talking about Stephen King with my subscribers and my friends. My favorite author to this day. I don't think anyone's gonna beat him for that matter, you know, knock on wood. Again, these books I recommend, they are short, sweet, to the point, great stories. A lot of these books I recommend are in the early days of Stephen King's publishing. Most of Stephen King's early published work is the great stuff. It's really juicy, has lots of great horror to it. And when Stephen King started off with Carrie, went on to Salem's Lot, and then Shining, and then everything else from that, he just kept turning away novels, and a lot of brilliant work from Stephen King. Remember, if you go in chronological order, you need to keep going in that order because you will start understanding more of the stories that you previously read, and you will understand to see more characters that keep popping up in other stories. So go check out Stephen King if you haven't. And like I always say, my friends, please read your book cover to cover. We'll see y'all later.